Chapter 1. The Madman on the Beach. When I saw Raphael for the first time, I was 12 years old. My family lived in a big town, far away from the sea. But my Uncle Miguel and his family lived in a little village on the coast. He had a cafe and a small farm there, and sometimes my family visited him. There in that village I met poor mad Raphael. I didn't know then who he was. I didn't know why he was mad. I knew nothing of his strange and terrible story. Now, 14 years later, I know exactly what happened. But Raphael is dead. Why should I tell people his terrible secret? Only I know what happened to Raphael. Only I know what happened to the young and beautiful Anita. And to the soldier. Only I. The people in the village told me what they knew. Their stories were all true. Every word. My uncle, his wife, Rodrigo the shopkeeper, nobody lied to me. Nobody. Not even poor Clara, Raphael's mother. And she was already dead when I went back to the village. Their stories were all true. But they didn't know what really happened. The first time I saw Raphael, I was walking along the beach with my younger brother Pablo. Our parents were talking with my uncle and his family. We boys went along the beach to look around. At the end of the beach, there were high black rocks, where the mountains behind the village came down into the sea. Near them was an old wooden boathouse. It had no doors. The roof was broken at one end and open to the sky. Inside there was an old wooden fishing boat. My brother and I looked inside. The sand was deep and soft on the floor. Suddenly, in a corner behind the boat, something moved in the shadows. It was a dirty young man with long hair and a beard. He stood up and looked at us. His eyes were open, but empty. He looked at us, but he didn't see us. He was very thin. He put one hand to his neck. I saw something shining under the dark beard. There was something small and bright on a thin fishing line round his neck. He pulled it out to show us. It was a small gold ring in the shape of a fish. Suddenly he spoke. His voice was clear but thin and high. He spoke words, but they didn't mean anything. "She gave me the golden fish," he said. "She gave it back to me." Then he laughed, and when he laughed, my brother and I were very afraid. He laughed and laughed, but his eyes were big and sad. We ran out of the boathouse. The thin young man came out behind us. He stood in the sunshine and laughed. "She gave me the ring," he shouted. "I still have it. Some little boys from the village came running. Some of them threw stones at the thin, dirty man. 'Crazy Raphael!' they shouted. 'Crazy Raphael!' He stopped laughing and screamed at them. Then he went back inside the boathouse. The children laughed and ran away. We went back to my uncle's house. 'Who is that crazy man on the beach?' we asked. The children called him Raphael. 'He's only a poor mad young man,' said my uncle. 'He isn't dangerous. He went mad about a year ago. We don't know why. Nobody can help him, I'm afraid. His mother lives in the house at the end of the village. She brings him food every day. All the people in the village help her when they can.' Soon the adults began to talk about other things. But I never forgot poor mad Raphael. Every time I thought about the village, I remembered the poor mad man in the boathouse on the beach. Sometimes I saw him in my dreams. He looked at me with his big, empty, mad eyes. He called to me. He had the gold ring round his neck, and he held it out to me. He called for me to help him. My family went back to the town. After I left school, I went to university in the capital. I studied to be a doctor. I spent 2 years in the USA. Finally, I came back to my hometown, and I found work in a big new hospital there. In all those years, I never went back to the village. But then, one of my uncle's sons got married, and all my family went there for a few days. There were many changes in the village. 12 years of change. There were new stone houses. There were new, brightly painted fishing boats along the beach, a lot of them with engines. My uncle had a big, clean, new cafe with tables and chairs, and a television in the corner. It was all very different from the village that I saw as a boy. I went down to the beach on my first afternoon in the village. I wanted to see again the place where I first saw Raphael. I couldn't believe it. The old boathouse and the boat were still there. The boat was in pieces now, but the boathouse was bigger and stronger. There was some new wood on the walls and a new roof on it. I walked along the beach and felt the soft sand under my town shoes. There was a man sitting near the old boathouse. He was looking at the sea. He had long hair and long, thin legs. I came closer and he suddenly looked round at me. It was Raphael. I saw again those same wide, crazy, sad eyes, the eyes from my dreams. He was 12 years older. His hair and beard were beginning to go gray, but they weren't as long and dirty as before. His face was very thin, and he looked ill. His clothes were old, but clean. "How are you, Raphael?" I called, smiling. He put his head on one side and looked at me. His mouth opened and he smiled. A thin brown hand moved up to his neck. "She gave me the golden fish," he said. His voice was flat and empty. He coughed suddenly, a deep, dry cough. Then he looked with sad yellow eyes at the bright, empty sea. I went back across the soft white sand to my uncle's house. I had an idea in my head. I was a doctor now. Perhaps I could find out what was the matter with this poor man. I could give him the best help that modern medicine could give him. I told my uncle what I wanted to do. There are special hospitals now in the capital for people like Raphael. I can take him there. If I can make him well, I will. If not, he can stay in a hospital there. He will have a bed, good food, nurses all the time. It's not good for him to sleep on the beach. He looks ill. I asked him to tell me about Raphael. He told me everything that he knew. It was a long and strange story. I wrote it all in a notebook. I wanted to help the poor madman to get well. For this, I had to know everything about him. Chapter 2. Raphael's Father and the Sharks. Told by my uncle Raphael was born in the village, my uncle said. His father was called Manuel, and he was a fisherman. His mother, Clara, is also dead now. She was the sister of my own wife, Rosa. Raphael was their only child. He was a fine boy, never ill, good-looking, healthy, and strong. When he was about 8 years old, his father was killed. It was a terrible thing for the young boy. He was there and saw his father die. They were out in their boat, fishing with some other men from the village. I don't know what happened exactly. Something happened to the fishing nets. Perhaps they were caught under the boat. Manuel went into the water to do something with them. Suddenly a shark attacked him. It was a complete surprise. The other fishermen could do nothing to help him. It was a big white shark. It came up from deep water and bit off one of Manuel's legs, a clean bite above the knee. The other men pulled him into the boat. The blood from his leg ran deep in the bottom of the boat. The men put a shirt round the top of his leg. They tried to stop the blood, but it was impossible. They say that Manuel was calm at first. He felt no pain. He smoked a cigarette, and he talked to little Raphael in the boat next to him. But after a few minutes, he went very white. Then he began to feel very cold. The men covered him with their clothes to keep him warm. But he became very weak and sleepy. Suddenly, he put his hand on Raphael's head. "Be a good son," he said. His voice was terribly tired. "Help your mother." Then he fell asleep, and in a few minutes his heart stopped. After that, Raphael and his mother, Clara, lived alone in their house at the end of the village. Manuel's brother, Ricardo, helped Clara with money. All the people in the village helped her. Manuel was a good man. We always help our people when they need it. In a few years, Raphael was older and started to work. He became a fisherman, too. He and his mother were poor, but he could earn enough money for them both. Raphael was a fine boy. He became a good fisherman, but he always hated sharks because of what happened to his father. Every few months, he did something very strange. When anyone in the village killed an animal for meat, Raphael asked them for the skin and the stomach. He took the insides of the animal that nobody wanted. Then he went out in his boat alone, far from the land. There he threw the pieces of the animal into the sea and waited for the sharks to come. A shark can smell blood in the water when it is many kilometers away. Soon, a lot of sharks arrived in the water round his boat. Then Raphael took his fishing spear. He stood up in his boat and killed one or two of them. When he killed a shark, the other sharks tasted the blood. They began to bite and eat the shark. So then there was more blood in the water, and more sharks came. Raphael killed more and more. After an hour, he was almost too tired to stand. It was a really dangerous thing to do in a small boat. But he was smiling when he told me about it. He was really happy about the dead sharks, because a shark killed his father. So Raphael grew up, tall, strong, and good-looking. And of course, he fell in love with Anita, the shopkeeper's daughter. "So now," said my uncle, "I have to tell you about Anita, too." Chapter 3. Anita, the shopkeeper's daughter. Told by my uncle, Anita was a beautiful child. My uncle continued, "I know most children are beautiful, but she was the most beautiful child that I've ever seen. Everyone loved her. Little children, old people, men and women, they all loved Anita. They smiled when they saw her. And year after year she grew up. And year after year she grew more beautiful. Her father, Rodrigo, the shopkeeper, loved her most. He tried to keep her close to him, always. She could never go out and talk with the village boys. But this is a small village. It was impossible to keep her at home all the time. She was a good girl, but all the young men dreamed of her and wanted to marry her. She was not only beautiful, she was clever too. Her father could read and write. Most of the people in the village couldn't. We had no school in the village in those days, so Rodrigo taught Anita to read and write. He often went into the town to buy things for his shop. Then he brought back picture magazines and small storybooks for her. Anita was very good at reading and telling stories. She remembered everything that she read. When she was only 9 or 10, she often sat near the house under a tree with a book. There she read or told stories to her little brothers and sisters. Soon the other children of the village came and sat round her. Some of the fishermen, old and young, sat on the beach near the shop too. They liked to listen to little Anita when she told her stories. Of course, Rodrigo had big plans for Anita. He was so proud of her. He wanted her to marry someone rich and important, perhaps a man from the city who was able to help Rodrigo's business. Everyone knew one thing for sure. He didn't want Anita to marry anyone from the village. Rafael loved her very much. They say Anita loved him too, but there was no hope for him. Rodrigo didn't want a poor fisherman to be Anita's husband. Poor Rodrigo. He loved Anita, and he had great hopes for her. When she ran away, it was terrible for him. He still doesn't talk about it. Not a word. Not after all these years. For him, he says, Anita is dead. He has no daughter of that name. But where did she go? I asked my uncle. Someone knows. And why is Rafael mad? Not because Anita ran away from home. She didn't run away with him, did she? No, she didn't, answered my uncle. That's for sure. Nobody knows where she went. But Rafael stayed in the village, and that was the time when he went mad. I believe that Anita ran away with the soldier. I think they're married. They're probably living in another town, far away. But that's only my opinion. I don't really know. The soldier? What soldier? I asked. My uncle smiled and looked at his watch. It's a long and strange story, he said. Chapter 4. The soldier told by my uncle. The soldier, said my uncle, came to the village about 3 months before Anita ran away. She was 16 years old then, and Rafael was 18. The soldier was a strange man. His real name was Carlos, but everyone called him the soldier. He told us about his life. I've been a soldier all my life, he told us. I was in Cuba for 6 years. Then I fought in Africa and many other places. I've seen the world, my friends. He had 1,000 stories, but nobody ever knew where he came from. He was very handsome, with bright eyes and long dark hair. He was a soldier, a sailor, a fisherman, everything. He had a small boat with an engine. That was unusual in those days. He worked for nobody. He went where he wanted to. He did what he wanted to. He bought things and sold things. He could get anything that you wanted for a price. He sailed into our village late one afternoon. He anchored his boat a few meters from the shore and walked up the beach. I never knew what he came for. It was just a small thing that he wanted, probably. First, he went to Rodrigo's shop. Then he came to my cafe and sat for an hour and talked. And there he saw Anita, sitting by the corner of the shop. The children were all round her on the ground, and she was telling them a story. He sat outside the cafe and talked for an hour or more about this and that. But his eyes never went far from the little group of children. At last, he asked me, "Is that girl your school teacher?" I laughed and said, "No, she's just the shopkeeper's daughter. She's only 16. She's not much older than a child." He left the village late in the afternoon before it got dark. He walked through the water to his boat and climbed in. We watched him start the engine. The boat moved away round the rocks at the end of the beach. Everyone in the village stopped what they were doing. Anita, too, stopped in her story. Everyone watched the strange thing, a boat that went without a sail. Of course, he came back. I told you, no man could ever forget Anita. A week or two later, his boat arrived again, and the good-looking stranger went to Rodrigo's shop. He bought a few things and talked with Rodrigo. Then he came to the cafe again. He had a drink and a talk with me. Then he went off again along the coast. Soon he came twice a week, on Thursdays and Sundays. He made friends with the people of the village. He was exciting and amusing. He was different from the people of the village. He was a stranger, but everyone seemed to like him. We listened to the stories about his travels and his life in other countries. He always spent an hour or two at my cafe. He sat and drank with us and told funny stories. Many of the fishermen came to the cafe when he was there. I liked him, the other men did too. He often brought little presents for people. He brought me a little cassette player one day. It was something new for us. We had no electricity in the village then, and we knew very little about the outside world. He showed me how it worked. Then he brought me new batteries for it every 2 weeks. He gave me some cassettes for it too, of music from the cities, dance music from Latin America, and Mexican love songs. A cafe must have music, he said. Music for the customers to enjoy. After that, I kept the little cassette player on the bar. Every time the soldier came to the cafe, I played some music for him. When the cafe was busy, I played music for the people of the village, too. He brought a paraffin lamp for Rodrigo to put in his shop. It was a very bright light. No house in the village had a light like it. The soldier was becoming very good friends with Rodrigo. Then, early one Monday morning, we heard a terrible noise from Rodrigo's house. He was shouting, his wife was screaming, and the children were all crying. It seems Anita wasn't in the house. Her bed was cold and empty. There was no note from her, not a word. Rodrigo wanted to get the police. "Somebody has stolen my daughter," he said. "Somebody has taken her away in the night, dead or alive." But then they found that her little box was empty. Anita's best clothes and favorite things weren't there. Even her little storybooks were gone. So Rodrigo stopped talking about bringing the police. For a few days he was terribly angry. He spoke wildly and fought with everyone. Nobody could speak to him. Then suddenly, he seemed to cut her out of his life. He never spoke her name again. He still doesn't talk about her. Only a brave man speaks Anita's name in front of him. We never saw the soldier again. He was here on the Sunday afternoon and evening. He usually was. He spent most of the evening in the cafe, listening to the music. Then he left at about 10 o'clock. I watched him go out to his boat. It was dark. There was no moon. But I heard him start his engine and go off to the west. And the next morning, Anita was gone. And we never saw her or the soldier again. So I, and most people in the village, believe that she ran away with the soldier. Nobody knows how they did it. We never saw him talk to her for a minute in the village. I think he waited for her in his boat along the coast, and she went to him in the middle of the night. Most of us believe they are living together somewhere, maybe with their own children now. But why did Raphael go mad? I asked my uncle. Who knows? He replied. Perhaps he went mad because he loved Anita. Then she ran away with the soldier. Who can say? He did love the girl very much. I knew it, and his mother did too. But marriage was impossible because Raphael was a poor, fatherless fisherman. But a man doesn't go mad for 13 years because a girl runs away from home, I said. Men often lose their wives, their children. People die in accidents. This doesn't make other people crazy. Rodrigo lost his favorite daughter, the light of his life, but he didn't go mad. Who can say? Said my uncle again. Who knows why things happen? Why does a man go mad? We know that Raphael was in love with Anita. He loved her for a long time before the soldier came to the village. We know that because of the gold ring. Ah, yes, I said. Tell me about the gold ring that Raphael wears round his neck. It's clearly a very important part of the story. Chapter 5. The gold ring told by my uncle Raphael, said my uncle, was in love with Anita. He wanted to marry Anita when she was only 15 or 16. His mother went to see Rodrigo to talk to him about it. I heard that Rodrigo was very polite to her. "I'm sorry," he said. "Anita is going to marry a rich businessman in the city. He's a very rich man and a friend of our family. Your son Raphael is a fine boy, but he's too young to get married, and he has nothing to give her, nothing at all." Raphael was very sad when he heard about Anita and the businessman. Then, after a few weeks, he suddenly left the village and went to the port on the coast. "I'm going to find work in the port," he said to his mother. "I want to see something of the world outside this village. I'll come back in a month or two." He put his few things in his boat and sailed along the coast to the port. It was 6 months before we saw him again. 6 months? What did he do there for 6 months? I asked my uncle. "You're lucky," he replied. "I can tell you. Raphael came to the cafe one evening. There were no other customers that night, and he told me about his time in the port. This is what he told me. Raphael stayed in the port all the time," my uncle said. "He slept in his boat on the beach. Sometimes he bought fruit and vegetables from the market after it closed. They were very cheap then. He worked for anyone. He did anything. He carried things for people. He loaded and unloaded boats and lorries. Every morning very early, he went fishing. Then he sold the fish on the beach before he started work. Slowly, very slowly, he began to save some money. Raphael met an old goldsmith in the town. He was a good old man. Raphael helped the goldsmith when he could. He cleaned his shop for him and brought packages and messages for him. He talked to him and made coffee for him. He watched him while he was working. Soon he became a good friend. Raphael never took any money from the old man. He never asked for any. Then one day, the goldsmith asked Raphael what he wanted. He knew he wanted something. And Raphael told him, "I want a gold ring for a girl in my village," he said. "It must be in the shape of a fish, a long fish with its tail in its mouth." "How much will this ring cost? I have some money. I know it's not enough, but I'll work for you until I've paid for it." The old goldsmith made the ring for him. I'm sure Raphael paid much less than its real cost, but it took 6 months of hard work to pay for it. Soon after Raphael came back to the village, he went with his mother to see Rodrigo. This time, Raphael spoke for himself. "Señor Rodrigo," he said quietly, "my father is dead, and my mother is poor. But I'm hard-working and honest, and I'll be a good husband to Anita. One day I'll be a rich man like your friend in the city. But I'll be a better husband to Anita than the businessman because I love her with all my heart." Then he gave the gold ring to Rodrigo as a present for Anita. Of course, Rodrigo didn't agree to a marriage between Anita and Raphael. He gave the ring back to Raphael. "I'm sorry," he said, "but Anita will marry the businessman in a year or two. That is decided, and I am not going to change my plans." "So Anita never got the ring," I said to my uncle. "After all that work and time, he couldn't give it to her." "He still has it on a piece of fishing line round his neck," my uncle said. "And when did the soldier come to the village for the first time? A few months after Raphael came back from the port, perhaps. I can't remember exactly." "But Raphael wasn't mad at that time?" Oh, no, not at all. In fact, he seemed very happy. Tell me about the time when he went mad. Was it the same time exactly when Anita went away with the soldier or later? It's difficult to remember. A lot of things happened at that time. What do you mean? What kind of things happened? Oh, little things, strange things. Santiago's old donkey disappeared. What do you mean? It disappeared. It did. It went. It disappeared. One day it was in the field behind his house. The next day, it wasn't there. Perhaps Anita stole it to ride on, but everyone knew Santiago's donkey. It was too old and weak to walk 100 meters. It couldn't carry a girl. What other strange things happened? I remember that on that last night, Raphael danced. Danced? Yes, he danced for hours, alone, here in the cafe. He never danced before, not in the cafe or anywhere. Or I never saw him dance. And of course he never danced again, because he went crazy. But I must start at the beginning. Chapter 6. The Night. When Raphael danced told by my uncle. It was a Sunday, said my uncle. The soldier arrived in his boat in the early afternoon, when everything was quiet. He lowered his anchor a few meters from the shore, as usual, and walked up the sand to the houses. He never pulled his boat up onto the beach. It was a heavy boat, and he didn't want to break the engine. He always left it in about 1 meter of water. That day he came first to the cafe. He sat and talked with me and some of the men. We all sat outside the cafe and listened to his stories. Then, later in the afternoon, he went to Rodrigo's shop and bought a few things. He had a big can of paraffin in the boat for Rodrigo's new lamp. I saw him give it to him. The soldier and Rodrigo sat and talked and drank coffee outside the shop for about an hour. When it got dark, he went with Rodrigo into the house behind the shop. I could see the bright light from the lamp through the window. Then the soldier had a meal with Rodrigo. After the meal, he came back to the cafe and sat with me and some of the fishermen. It was very dark, and we sat inside. The soldier seemed very happy. He told us a lot of funny stories about his life as a soldier. Then, at about 9 o'clock, Raphael came into the cafe. We were surprised to see him, because Raphael didn't spend a lot of time at the cafe. And he never came into the cafe when the soldier was there. That night he was wearing his best clothes. Usually he wore his old clothes, even in the cafe. He was wearing his best shirt and trousers. His face and hands were very clean, and his hair was still wet and shiny from washing. I asked myself, is he trying to show the soldier that he is not just a poor fisherman? The soldier knew Raphael. He knew that he wanted to marry Anita. Everyone in the village talked about it. Raphael knew that the soldier was also interested in her. Everyone in the village talked about that too, but nobody knew the secret game that the soldier was playing. Raphael and the soldier didn't speak. The cafe was quiet. Nobody spoke. Suddenly, the soldier took a cassette from his pocket. "Let's have some music," he said, giving me the cassette. I took it and put it into the player. I remember it was a love song. It was sung by a girl with a soft and beautiful voice. We all sat and listened to it. Raphael smiled and listened too. When the cassette ended, I put another cassette in the player, but the soldier stood up. "It's getting late," he said. "I must go." He went out into the dark night. It was about 10 o'clock, I think, his usual time. A few minutes later, we heard the noise when he started the engine of his boat. Then the sound of the engine went slowly along the coast. Soon everything was quiet again. We could hear only the sea and the music. The girl on the cassette was singing another love song. It was a sad song, slow but strong. The fisherman and I sat quietly and listened. Suddenly, Raphael stood up in the corner of the cafe and began, very slowly, to dance. Alone in the shadows, his eyes closed, he moved to the music. He danced, his head back, eyes closed, a strange half-smile on his face. We all watched him in surprise. After a few minutes we laughed and went on talking. But Raphael went on dancing alone for the rest of the evening. Every time the music stopped, he looked at me with big, dark eyes and said, "Again." And I put another cassette in the machine. Then Raphael smiled, closed his eyes, and continued dancing. At midnight, all the other men went off to bed. Raphael was still there, still dancing. I watched the poor boy until the song ended. Then I switched off the machine. I said good night to him and sent him home to bed. Then the next morning, before daylight, we heard shouting and crying from Rodrigo's house. The news went round the village like fire. Anita wasn't there. Rodrigo sent all his family and friends out to look for her. They looked along every road, big and small. They looked in the fields and along the beach, in the rocks, everywhere. Later, Raphael came out of his house with his mother. I told them about Anita, and they were very surprised. We all were. Raphael went to his boat immediately. He planned to sail along the coast and look for her. He sailed away to the west. I watched him until I couldn't see him. He sailed round the rocks at the end of the village. He was looking at the land as he went. The next time I saw him, he was mad. Everybody in the village was out looking for Anita that morning, but nobody found her. Then Santiago couldn't find his old donkey. He came to Rodrigo's shop. He was shouting that Anita took it. Rodrigo was very angry. He wanted to hit Santiago and knock him down. I thought he wanted to kill the old man. Some friends of Santiago took him away quickly. After that, he said nothing more about the donkey. Then, early in the afternoon, some of the fishermen found Raphael. He was about 1 kilometer west of the village, in a quiet place near the high rocks. His boat wasn't far from the shore, and Raphael was lying in the bottom of it. He was wet and dirty. He was looking up at the sky and laughing, and he was completely mad. They brought him in the boat back to the village. His mother and I washed him and gave him some water. We put him to bed. But he lay and made noises all night. He screamed and fought. He was like a mad animal. The next day he went out of the house and sat by his boat. He looked at the sea all day and said nothing. We waited day after day. We gave him food and drink. We washed him when we could, but he was like a small child. We waited for him to get better, but he never did. "And you never found out what made him mad?" I asked my uncle. "He never speaks, only about the ring. You know everything that I know now," he said. "When we were washing the poor boy, we found the gold ring on a fishing line round his neck. When we tried to take it off, he screamed, so we left it there. All these years later, he still wears it round his neck. He gave 6 months of his life to buy that ring, his present for Anita, which she never had." Chapter 7. 2 Visits. The next morning, I went with my uncle to see Rodrigo, the shopkeeper. He had a fine supermarket now built of stone. He still lived in a house behind the shop. But now the house was 2 floors high and had a garden with a wall round it. He also had his own lorry with his name on it, and there was a new car next to the shop. It was clear that Rodrigo had plenty of money now. Inside the supermarket there were all kinds of tins and packets. There were boxes of fresh fruit and vegetables outside the door. It was the biggest shop in the village, and it seemed to sell everything. Rodrigo was a big, heavy man. He was about 50 years old, and he wore a fine white suit and a white hat. When we arrived, he was unloading boxes of tins from the lorry. He was picking them up, 3 at a time, and taking them into the shop. He was big and fat, but he was still a very strong man. He was polite and friendly to my uncle and me. He knew I was a doctor. He invited us into his house. We sat and had coffee and talked about the changes in the village since my first visit as a boy. At last, I told him my ideas for helping Raphael. Then he wasn't so friendly. "A doctor," he said. "He needs more than a doctor. I don't know why he's crazy. Nobody does. God knows. I've helped him and his mother over the years. I've given them food when they were hungry, and money when they needed it. His poor mother was a good and hard-working woman. Now she's dead. It was a terrible thing to happen to her. Terrible. First, her young husband was killed by a shark. Then her only son went crazy and lived on the beach like an animal. Some people say that love made him mad, but you're an intelligent man, doctor. You've studied at university. Does a young man of 18 years go mad for love of a girl? A strong young man in good health? It's a stupid idea. I believe he wasn't in good health. I think he was ill. I don't know the problem exactly. You're the doctor. Help him. Make him better if you can. But look for the facts. Don't listen to people's silly stories." "So you don't think that your daughter Anita was the reason for his madness?" I asked. Rodrigo didn't look at us. He looked at the wall for a long time. "I don't have a daughter called Anita," he said at last. "I had one many years ago, but she's dead." After that, he said nothing more about Raphael or Anita. Soon we thanked him and left. Later that morning, a man came to my uncle's house. He was small and thin. He stood at the back door with his hat in his hands. When my uncle saw him, he brought him inside. He found a chair for him and gave him a drink. "This is Luis Valdez," he said to me. "He's a farmer. He has a farm just outside the village to the east." We sat and talked about farms and the weather. Then the man began to ask me about Raphael. "Is it true, the story that I hear?" he asked. "Are you trying to save Raphael, the poor crazy boy?" "I'm a doctor," I answered. "And yes, I'm interested in Raphael. I'm trying to find out why he went mad. Perhaps I can make him better, perhaps not." "My wife asked me to talk to you," he said. "She's Marta, Rodrigo's second daughter and Anita's younger sister. She says she wants to talk to you about Anita and Raphael, but it must be a secret. She knows things that even her father Rodrigo doesn't know. She wants to help Raphael, but she doesn't want to make her father angry or unhappy after all these years. Her secrets will be safe with me," I said. "I don't want to make the people in the village unhappy. I only want to help Raphael. If she knows anything about Raphael, I'll be happy to talk to her." That evening I went alone to Luis's house. Luis sent his children to bed, and Marta began to tell me her story. Chapter 8. The Young Princess, told by Marta. I'm Rodrigo's second daughter, Marta told me. I was 7 years younger than Anita. When I was a little girl, it was very strange. Anita was beautiful, I wasn't. Anita was clever, I wasn't. She could read and tell stories, sing and draw pictures. I couldn't. I was small, fat, and stupid. But I've been lucky I married a good husband. I have 2 healthy sons and a pretty daughter. Now I'm very happy with my life. But I must tell you about my sister Anita. It's true that she was beautiful and clever, but I'm sorry to say, she wasn't a very good child, not very nice. Our parents gave her everything she wanted. She could do anything she liked. She never worked or helped our mother in the house. I remember that her hands were always clean and beautiful. Her fingernails were long and pink. They were never broken or bitten like mine. Everyone thought she was beautiful and clever. Everyone smiled at her. Everyone did what she wanted. She became proud and lazy. I remember she told us stories, sitting near the house. But her voice was very loud and clear, and all the people near us could hear her clever words. She often sang to herself in the house, but she sang only when there were people outside to hear her. I'm sorry. This isn't important, really, but she did other things, worse things. We slept in a small room at the back of the old house. I was only 8 or 9 years old then. Anita had most of the room for her things, and I slept in the corner. One night, I remember, it was very late. Our parents were in their room asleep, and something woke me up. I saw Anita going quietly out of the room. She was wearing a dress and shoes. The moon was very bright that night, and I couldn't sleep again. I lay awake, waiting. About half an hour later, Anita came quietly back into the room and got into her bed. "Where have you been?" I asked her. She was very angry because I was awake. "Go to sleep, stupid girl," she said. "I had stomach ache. I only went out for a few minutes. Don't say anything to anyone." I said nothing, but after that I watched her. I saw her go out on other nights. At last, I asked her where she went. She laughed quietly. "I go to meet my prince," she said. That was all that she said. Her head was full of the stories that she read in her books. She loved stories about princes and princesses, stories about magic carpets which could fly, and magic lamps and rings. These were the stories that she told us most often. She didn't have to read them. She knew them all. She imagined that she was a beautiful princess in a story. She never believed that she was only a shopkeeper's child. Perhaps a king gave her to her parents in secret when she was a baby. She had many strange and silly ideas in her head. But who did she go to see? Who was this prince? I asked Marta. It was Raphael, of course, she replied. They were in love, even when they were little children. She went out at night to the big rocks at the end of the beach. Raphael came and met her there. They sat there in the rocks in the moonlight. They talked about their love and the happy married life that they planned. Our parents had no idea that she was doing this, of course. Anita told me to keep quiet about it. "If you tell anyone," she said, "I'll say terrible things about you to our parents. They'll believe me. They won't believe you." And it was true. I knew it was true. They always believed Anita.